Hello! In this class I'm going to teach you how to do embossing by hand. You can use either a stencil that you've purchased, one that you cut using a die cutter like a Cricut or a Silhouette machine, or I will show you how to design and cut one by hand. This technique can be used in an immense amount of ways. You can add your own embossed initials, create cards, or design abstract things to put into paper or card. We're going to make it a card in this class, though you're welcome to start with a monogram or something simple to get a real feel for the technique. Join me as we emboss by hand. Hi everybody, today I'm going to show you some very simple techniques you can use in your own home or your own studio to do some very basic but really effective embossing on paper and card. The first thing you're going to need is what you want to emboss. So I've got two examples here. I have a piece of watercolor paper that's about 160 GSM, and I've got a white card. This card is much thicker. You can probably hear that nice wobbly noise that it makes. And this paper is about as thick as 2 sheets of printer paper. You can do this on any kind of paper. I suggest doing slightly thicker because once you do anything on a thinner piece of paper, it's harder for it to hold the embossing without you puncturing it. So let me show you a quick example of what you can produce with this. So this is an example of something I've produced, and you can see in the light there that it's sort of embossed dots, and I created a template essentially just using a hole punch. And you could do something similar to this. I think this is very cool and very effective. It's quite minimalist and relatively easy to produce. Or you can do something a little bit more engaged, like this, which I've done, which is a map of Paris. So I drew out the streets and then essentially punched holes into a card so I could then trace them onto this paper. And it feels amazing. It's really wonderful, but it's sort of hard to see, but it's really effective when you have side light, as you can see there. And that's about, this piece here is about 210 millimeters, that's 21 centimeters, which is less than a foot for those of you who operate in that. So this is a really good example of something interesting you can do. But we're just going to do a basic card today. Besides the paper or card that you're going to use, as I said, I've got these two here. You're also going to need a piece of thin cardboard, so something like this. What I've got here is probably 1 millimeter thick, so that's thinner than, say, your average, or about as thin as your average cereal box. So if you don't have any card like this, this is just craft. Actually, it's a mailer that I use to put between things to protect them when I post it, but it's only about 1 millimeter thick, so that's really as thick as you need to go. You want something that's stiff, so a little bit stiffer than card, but you don't want something too thick because it's really hard to cut through. So I would suggest, if you don't have this, use the side of a cereal box or something just a little bit in that area. So you'll need those. You will, for this project, need either a cutting implement, if you're going to do it by hand, and this is what I would use, or if you have a Silhouette or a Cricut machine, and I'll show that to you for those of you who don't have them, this will make the process super quick and super simple. So this is the Silhouette Cameo machine. It's quite large, so I can't actually fit it in the frame. But if you have a die cutter, you'll know what it is. You could even use something like, I think, the Silhouette Mint, which is a little bit smaller. I think that cuts as well. So if you've got a die cutter, that's a really good option to make your template from. But we're going to do this by hand, relatively simple. So one of the things you can do, if you think that this project is a bit much for you, we're just going to cut a simple card with a couple of words on it, but it will take a little bit of time. If that's too much for you, consider just using an initial or just a simple word, maybe your first 3 initials or something like that. So you can emboss paper or card as a way of signing your work. Something very basic and interesting, or a decorative motif, a sun, a flower, something like that. This technique will work for all of that. So we've got the paper, we've got what you're going to cut with. You're going to need something to emboss with, which is essentially pushing through the paper but not entirely through it. Now what I actually have here, this is an NT cutter, which you can see on the side, which is the same as this one. This is the swivel knife, which is my favorite for paper cutting. But this one I actually bought because it's very appropriate for traveling, because essentially it has 2 things in the end. It has a hole punch on it, and it has another knife on the other end, but it's very safety oriented, which is great. But on the end here, this bit, which I never used until I started this type of project, is actually for embossing, for tracing things out. So actually this is quite perfect for pressing through on the paper. If you have something like these are actual sort of embossing tools. They're technically for clay, but I use them for paper. These cost, I think about $5 or so on Amazon. I just got 3 of them. They're by a brand called Paper Mania, but I'm sure you can find more. But if you don't have any of these things, feel free to use like the back of a pen, a mechanical pencil, when you've taken out the lead, something that will press down into the paper but won't actually puncture it. So something in this area. I'm sure you can find something in your house that will work. So you'll need something to actually do the embossing with, and you will need some tape, which will hold any stray pieces in place. You will probably need a cutting surface, is what I have here. And I highly suggest that you have a light tracing board. That's what this is, and it essentially plugs in. It's just got a little USB plug, and so it lights up. And you can see this lights up, and this is what I will use to essentially be able to trace the paper on. It's not strictly necessary, but it does make things much easier. And this one cost, I think, about $15 on Amazon. It's cheap, it's a little bit broken, but it totally works for what I need it to do. And what happens is when you put your template on top, and I'll show you an example of a template I previously made. So this one, with the holes in it, when you put it on top, it makes it really easy to see through. So that essentially then when you put your paper in, like this, you can actually just see straight through where it is you need to be pressing. So I think this makes things much, much easier. So if you've got one, great, use it. If you don't, it's not strictly necessary for the project. It just makes things simpler. If you decide that you really like it and it's a technique you're going to use, consider investing in one of these. Like, it's really not that expensive. So you'll need that. And then possibly you might need a ruler, depending on what you're going to do. If you want to design your design in Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator, I'll show you briefly how to do that and some basic tips you'll need. So the first thing you should do is create something in the size of your actual card. In this case, I've measured my card. It's 148 millimeters by 148 millimeters. So I've chosen this font for various reasons, because the strokes, the up and down bits of the font are actually quite uniform. There's nothing particularly strange about this font. It's Gill Sans. So when you zoom in, you can see that it's about thick enough for the tool that I have for embossing. It isn't super thick, so such that I have to go around each section. I can actually just press right through the center of that, which works really well for text. There aren't too many places like this where the actual strokes taper a bit. So that's nice, because if it does taper too much, you might not get a good and clear emboss on it. And it would also be hard to cut out if you're doing it by hand. So I've chosen that, I've centered it, so I will know reasonably what my card will look like. And it's helpful to have that thing in front of you to go, okay, I think that's about the right size. Opt to go a little bit bigger rather than a little bit smaller. If it's too small, it's a really problem, but if it's too big, it still looks fairly decent when you do it. If you're opting to cut this out by hand, I suggest at this point that you design a simple monogram of your initials. The rest of the process will go relatively smoothly and quickly. If you're a bit fearless and don't mind mistakes, go for the whole thing and make the card, but make sure that the font you're using is wide enough and doesn't have too many fine details. I think it bears pointing out that the reason I've designed this in the center of the actual card size is so that I know where it will fit on the card. But when I translate that to the actual card that I'm going to be cutting out, or the stencil that you're using, you want to make sure that you have an idea about where that cutout that you're going to be using to emboss is located within the larger size of your project. So I'm using an A4 size piece of card, and I've set the actual text into the center so that I'm essentially not pressing the card off the sides. You might end up damaging whatever it is you're embossing if it's not as flat as possible. So just consider how you're going to use it and where you want it to be in the larger scale of things. A4 is clearly the largest size I'm going to use here because the A4 light board that I've got is obviously the same size as the paper. So I've positioned everything within that. So before you go transferring or printing or cutting, if you were making this by yourself, I just want you to consider how you're going to use it and where it should be positioned on the actual card. You're going to need to print that out and transfer it onto your card stock. Now, if you have something like a Silhouette or a Cricut, some sort of die cutter, you can do what I've done here, which is actually push this through the die cutter. And so I quickly designed this in Adobe Illustrator, but you can of course do it in Inkscape or something like that. And I cut this through twice on a deep setting on the Silhouette. And so this is very helpful because this is essentially already almost done for me. So if you have one, I'll show you how to deal with this when we're done hand cutting it. But this can make things much faster. If, however, you don't have that, you will want to write or draw onto the piece of card yourself. So I went ahead and traced this out onto card using pen. It doesn't really matter which direction you use it. You can even do this by hand. It doesn't matter so long as the lines are relatively even. And with this, I'm just going to hand cut this out. And this is where it's going to take a little bit of time. So as I suggested previously, if you think that this will be too much, or you think it's biting off more than you want to deal with right away, just consider doing maybe 3 letters. Don't worry if there are pieces in the center. We'll cut these out individually, but you want to hold on to them if you do cut them out, and I'll show you what to do with them, but you'll need to keep them because we want to make sure that the letter is the correct shape. So if you're like me and you want to do hand cutting, I will show you very quickly just how to go through this. Now, I'm not actually going to be using these letters for anything, so it doesn't matter if I don't cut them out perfectly. What's important is just that they come out cleanly, and I maintain those edges, and particularly the corners. Keep that nice and clean, because that's where the letterpress will go through. You want to make sure that your actual design is not too wide. I find that particularly with the beginning of the embossing, it's really helpful if the actual stroke widths, so how wide your letters are, is somewhat constrained. You can use other shapes that are much bigger, but you just have to be careful when you're embossing that you're going around the edges. And I sometimes find that when the things are too thick, it doesn't come out as crisply as I would like. One of my friends described this process after I tried it out as MacGyvering a letterpress. And I think that was probably quite accurate, but you just have to be a little gentle and a little careful with what you're doing. So I'm just going round all of my letters here. You want to make sure to take out the center bit first. And if you've never done any cutting before, and if you're doing it by hand, it can be a little bit tricky with card. You just want to use even pressure and make sure that you are taking out the center first, because it's much harder. There we go. To take it out once that whole, like letter A for instance, is removed. So I'm going to hold on to that. That's very important because I'll need that, otherwise that letter A isn't going to be right. So I'm going to actually just make sure to hold this off to the side because we're going to have to reposition this later on. So I'm just going to set that up here and cut the rest of this out. So I pulled that whole letter out, so I might actually just keep that up top with my little piece so that I know how to position it correctly. Again, when cutting curves, I find it easiest to hold the knife in and continuously reposition the actual material you're cutting from. Just go back. That's good. I'll do the same thing again here. You can do what I did here, which is called overcutting, where you cut through at the top where each line would connect. It's fine to do it here. That won't actually affect the way that your final piece looks, but you have to be careful when you're doing things like this because you don't want to actually overcut any of the distinctive edges, as it were. You really do want to make sure that any ragged edges you have, particularly on the letters, are cleaned up because that can affect your actual final product. Right, so your next step is to take your tape. In this case, I'm just using some very cheap masking tape. And I want you just to tape over the front of the text. Now, it's very important when you're doing something like text to recognize which side you need to be facing up, that you want your text to read the correct way. So you're going to be pressing in from the back because your paper has to go on the back. So you want to make sure that your tape is on the front side. If you put it on the back, you'll just have to move it all around again because you can't do it from the front unless you want to deboss it rather than emboss it. Very good. So what that means now is that we've got a nice slightly sticky side on the other side. And so I'm actually just going to go back and use those little pieces that I had to put them in. Now, if you weren't able to keep your letters all in position, it's not a big deal. You just want to make sure that your little pieces are somewhere near where they need to be. So I still have my letters like this, so I can just pop that piece in and then do the same for this one. So that piece goes into position and then just move this one. So that's one way to put them in. The other way to put them in is to just make sure that you've got the piece that you need in the correct way around, and it will help because you can sort of see them from, you can see how like I've got the actual ink on this side, so that should be the side that faces down, not up. So you can actually just use the point of your knife to help reassemble these. And I know it's a little bit fiddly, but it is really worthwhile to do it. You know, maybe if you have trouble, end up using a tweezers or something. That's the way you would hand create a stencil. Otherwise, feel free to use a stencil or an actual die cutting machine. With the die cutting machine, what happens is I've designed this and sent it to be cut out. And as I said before, I had that cut out twice so that it would go through as best as possible. And a die cutter is really just a printer with a blade in it. And so it's actually still on this sticky mat, which you can see here, which makes all of this quite easy. So I just have to go in and do what we sometimes call weeding, where you just go in and pull these bits out. And some of them may or may not come out easy. It looks like this has come out quite simple, which is great. something to be aware of with whatever material you're using is that it might, like this piece of card, essentially you have like two very flat surfaces pressed around a bunch of fibers, which means that sometimes you have to go back and remove more. You want to make sure to leave the interior letters like this E, if you've got it, in place. So I often like put my knife down and then pull the actual letter up around it, which tends to help keep that in place. And you can just reposition it if there's still a problem. You just go back and pull all of these bits out. There we go. So that's been pulled out. So you see how easy that is when you have a die cutter to do that with. So you want to take your tape, press it out across the front, and this is going to hold those little pieces in place when we remove it from the mat. And actually the tape, you don't want it to be too sticky because when you press the paper through, it can actually reach all the way to the tape. And then sometimes it can cause the paper or the card to become a bit sticky. So there we are. So we've masked that out, and then it's literally going to pull that off. Oops, and it looks like actually my A didn't come up. There we go. You want to make sure that you're actually pulling up the letter pieces when you go. So there's that one. So what we're going to do next is actually work with the light board. So go ahead and plug yours in. Mine has a nice long cord. Take the stencil that you're actually using so you can see how easy and good that is. And then place either your paper or your card on top of it. Now I'm going to do the card first. Actually the card is a little bit harder than the paper, but what I wanted to do was make the card. And you just want to think and consider very briefly when you're doing this which side is going to be the front. Because actually I'm going to be pressing from this side in. So this side should actually be the interior of the card, the side that you're working from. Now one thing you can do to check about which side you're actually working from is to sort of, once you've folded your card, to then pull up your template and set it on top. So you know this will be your front, and so that's where you want it. And then if you just hold those two together and flip it over, you'll see which part of the card you should be working on. And so then I want to just center that roughly. I think that's fine. And then I will just take out a little bit of masking tape and tape down the top edge and the bottom edge. It will actually stay in place relatively easy once you start to actually emboss it. But because this is a card and I have nothing to hold it against, because usually I'm holding a piece of paper against this edge which holds everything in place, I'm actually just going to tape it down a little bit. So you now want to take your actual embossing tool, and like I said, I had these, but if I was just doing it straightforward I'd just be using this one, and you would just literally press it in to these places. You want to be careful what you're using, in case on the card, for instance, you could probably test it, see if you rub it out what that looks like. So this one actually leaves a bit of a mark, but I think that one of these will not. But the thing about these is that each one has a different size end, and I had actually, you can see I've written sort of order on them, but I think the slightly larger ones will be perfect for this. And it's just very straightforward. All you do is follow along and just press into the edge, and you want to follow along the actual gap. You want to try very hard not to go over. You just want to follow the edge. Particularly on card, it will show through. So just be gentle. You can see I just sort of messed that up there. But you just straightforward press the card into that. And you don't want to press too hard. You Just give it a little bit of pressure at first and put more pressure in. You might start to hear a tiny bit of tearing if you're pressing too hard. You just go around those edges. This is very noticeable in the card, much less noticeable in the paper as you go around these edges. And you want to try your best just to do the edges and not actually any thicker space. Because when you press into the sort of thicker spaces where you're not on an edge, you get a much less clean and crisp emboss. One thing you can also do is if you find that actually the thing you're using is a bit too big, find something that's a little bit smaller. That might help. And just gently trace that along. And this is why I find the light board so helpful. Actually, if I turn off the lights, you might even see that better. It's a little bit harder for me to see, but I think that will turn out all right. You just trace along the side of each letter, making sure not to forget to go around your actual interior. And you'll feel once that paper really conforms to that shape, and you'll know that you don't need to press anymore. It's much harder to go back after you're done and do it again. You can easily slot it in, but you'll find that if you off by just a little bit, it's really noticeable. So I find it best to just try and make sure you've gone around all of those edges very securely while it's still in place. Which is why it's best to do it as you go along each edge the first time. And you find sometimes that like the actual card or the paper or even the template that you're using is not as conducive to pressing as you might want it to be. So just go gentle. You don't need to go all the way all at once. And I'm finding for some reason that something about the angle of the Y on the long side is a bit strange, and the card doesn't like it. So I'm just going to gently run that along the side. There we go. Making sure to get that nice crisp point there. And you'll notice actually as you press in, you can see that now this B looks quite wide as compared to this A, and that's because the A and this Y, for instance, I've already pressed down, and so it's really conforming. There's no little bit of light refraction between the paper and the card. So that's one way. If you're not sure what you've already pressed down, you'll start to see the difference after you've done it, because it starts to really conform. There we go. So I think I'm done. Run my finger over those. Make sure I don't feel anything missing. Making sure you got your dots, which are sometimes the easiest to forget. I'll just turn those lights back on. I'm just going to peel off that tape. Light, and you can see the card is now embossed. You can particularly see from the top and the side when the light hits it just how cool that is, and people find it very impressive. I think that's great and will go over very well. Now I'm going to show you just briefly one of the other templates that I did. This one, which is the abstract design with a piece of paper, so you have a good idea about what that also looks like, because it's much easier to work with the paper than the card, but I thought I would show you both. So this bit is much easier because essentially I just press it up against the side here and press this up against the side as well, and then we'll just plug this in. go. And so then it's very easy to see that. And I find particularly with this, and so it's one of the things that I could suggest to you is to use a hole punch, but most people don't have a hole punch of varying sizes and would find making this a little bit tedious. But I found that with this one particularly, just using one of my slightly larger ballpoints, all I have to do is literally just press it into that little cutout hole there, and it goes through and makes those shapes beautifully. Now these circles are all varying diameters, and I wouldn't suggest pressing just like this on anything that was too large, because this works really well for the little ones, because there's absolutely no way that I can puncture the paper because this is so large and the hole is so small. But eventually we'll get to a point probably after these where it becomes a little bit too problematic to do that. And so you just have to sort of circle it round. But it doesn't take very much force to do this. You can actually sort of see as I do it. I don't know whether or not it will show up on the video, but you can sort of see the varying light aspects. You can see a lot in this one, and that's because I'm much closer to having pressed through than I was in the other one. Now I want to use a slightly smaller ball to just go around those edges, trying always to stay within the bounds of the actual cutout, because you will notice from the other side if you score it outside of that, because you're putting down so much pressure like I did there. You'll probably be able to see that. From the other side. Just takes a little bit of practice, and frankly it's fine. We're done, and then you pull that up, flip that over. You can see from the side just how nice that looks. And actually you can't really see any of the times that I slipped out there. But don't those look nice? I'll zoom in and focus on those. See how neat that is. And so then I would normally go ahead and cut this out to make sure that that is nice and square. We can also use this design on cards, which I think I will also do. So there we are. So when you're done with all of that, you can do all sorts of things with that technique. Simple to quite complex, as I showed you before. And I just think it makes a really great technique. And then of course you can frame it and do things like this, which I think looks quite awesome. I like playing with light and shadows, and I think you will too. So feel free to go ahead and take that and run with it. So thanks so much for joining me.